A real crisis does not arrive like a movie. It arrives like paperwork, silence, and suddenly missing options. The public thinks seizure means soldiers kicking doors and hauling crates. That can happen in localized disasters, but most modern states do not need that level of friction. They seize by turning knobs you didn't know existed. A banking holiday is a seizure of access without touching your wallet. Purchase limits are a seizure of time and priority. A checkpoint is a seizure of movement. An emergency order is a seizure of choice because the threat of enforcement makes the optional feel mandatory. In the first 48 hours, the government's primary instinct is not to hunt you. It is to stabilize the narrative and the logistics. That means controlling what moves, what is traded, what is stored, and what is believed. If you treat this like a game of hiding contraband, you will lose. You will also deserve to lose because you will be fighting the wrong war. The old world collapses through systems, not through scenes. Your job is not to outsmart authority. Your job is to make your life resilient when systems become hostile to ordinary people. So the phrase, how to hide them, must be translated into something usable and lawful. How to reduce exposure, how to avoid being the loudest target, how to keep your household functioning when access is constrained. That means planning for freezes, rationing, priority lanes, curfews, and forced documentation. It means designing your resources so they are boring, defensible, and supportable, not flashy, illegal, or easy to confiscate because you advertise them. The margin of error is zero because in a crisis, mistakes are not lessons. Mistakes are amputations, arrests, or funerals. This series is not about evasion. It is about continuity. 9 categories get controlled early because they are levers of public order. You will treat each category like a supply chain problem and a legal risk problem at the same time. That is the only way you keep what matters when the rules start moving under your feet. The first seizure in a modern crisis is not a knock at the door. It is the removal of frictionless money. Governments and central banks do it because cash flow is oxygen, and oxygen must be metered when panic spreads. They declare bank holidays, cap withdrawals, throttle wire transfers, restrict foreign exchange, freeze accounts under temporary review, and pressure payment networks to prioritize essential transactions. None of this requires a courtroom drama. It requires a signature and a press conference. Your balance may still exist on a screen, but access becomes conditional, delayed, or rationed. That gap between ownership and access is where households break. Your protocol is not to play outlaw games. Your protocol is to design liquidity that survives policy shocks while remaining clean and explainable. Start by accepting that one single rail is a single point of failure. A household that only has a debit card is a household that can be turned off by a decision made in another building. You build redundancy across formats and institutions, and you keep each layer boring. You maintain a controlled reserve of physical cash for short-duration outages and caps, not as a fantasy hoard, but as a bridge for groceries, transport, and medicine when terminals go dark. You keep it in small denominations because change disappears first, and you track what you hold. Because in a crisis, memory becomes unreliable. You keep a second access path to your accounts, because losing a phone can lock you out as effectively as a freeze. Paper copies of key account details stored securely are not paranoia, they are continuity. You also treat documentation like armor. When authorities tighten controls, they do not ask philosophical questions. They ask for proof. You keep legitimate records for income, transfers, and major purchases. You avoid sudden behavior that looks like panic, not because panic is immoral, but because panic draws friction. You reduce revolving debt before the storm because interest and minimum payments become a trap when limits hit. You keep a baseline of essential bills on autopay only if you can sustain it through disruptions, and you are ready to switch to manual control if the system starts double charging or misrouting. Most people lose money in crises without a single officer touching them. They lose it because they built their life on convenience rails that can be shut down. You are not smarter than the system. You are simply prepared for it to fail. Fuel is not just energy. In a crisis, it becomes permission. The moment supply chains wobble, the state's next move is to control movement, because movement equals uncertainty. That control rarely starts with confiscation. It starts with rationing, priority allocations, restricted sales hours, price controls that cause shortages, and checkpoints that turn a simple drive into an interview. Gas stations become flashpoints, and anything that moves becomes politically sensitive. When authorities say essential travel, they are defining who gets to eat, who gets to work, who gets medical care, and who gets stuck. Your vehicle, your fuel, and your ability to move quietly through chaos become strategic assets, whether you want them to or not. Your first rule is safety and legality, because fuel mishandled will destroy you faster than any policy. If you store fuel, you do it within local regulations, in approved containers, in proper ventilation, away from ignition sources, and in quantities that do not turn your home into an accelerant. A crisis does not forgive amateur chemistry. You also rotate what you store. Fuel that sits becomes a liability. Rotation is not a hobby detail. It is operational discipline. If you cannot maintain a rotation schedule, you do not store it, because you are building a future failure. Your second rule is continuity planning under restricted mobility. Assume you will not be able to just go when you want. Build a smaller operating radius and make it work. Know your critical routes and your alternate routes, but do not treat this as a game of dodging authority. Treat it as a map of choke points, closures, and time costs. Keep your vehicle maintained before the crisis, not during it, because parts and mechanics vanish when demand spikes. Keep your tires, battery, and fluids in a condition that minimizes breakdown risk, because a disabled car in a tense environment is not an inconvenience. It is exposure. Your third rule is documentation and legitimacy. During rationing and checkpoints, the people who move most smoothly are the people who can explain themselves fast. Keep your registration, insurance, and any required permits current and accessible. If you have medical needs or caregiving responsibilities that justify travel, keep your documentation organized and protected. This is not about arguing. This is about passing through friction with minimum delay. Fuel controls are predictable because they are rational. Movement spreads panic, crime, and contagion. Authorities will always try to throttle it. You survive by designing your life so you do not need to move far to stay alive. Food is the second lever after money because a hungry population becomes ungovernable faster than a broke one. The first controls are soft. Purchase limits appear overnight. Staples vanish first because they are fungible and easy to store. Retailers get directives, not suggestions, and the shelves become a theater where the public learns what scarcity looks like. Then the controls harden. Distribution gets centralized, relief points get established, and priority households are defined by bureaucracy, not by need. In localized disasters, the risk becomes even more blunt. Supplies can be requisitioned for shelters, kitchens, or emergency services, and what was once private property becomes resources in the eyes of an overstretched response system. Most families do not lose food because someone takes it. They lose it because they waited until everyone else was desperate. Your protocol is to treat food like continuity inventory, not like a trophy. The goal is quiet resilience, not spectacle. You build depth in staples that you already eat, because novelty stockpiles become waste, and waste is indistinguishable from stupidity when calories matter. You maintain rotation as doctrine. The oldest moves first, the newest moves to the back, and every week the pantry proves it can feed you without a shopping trip. That weekly proof is how you find gaps while the world is still normal enough to fix them. You also design your food profile for the reality of disruption. Cooking may be constrained by fuel limits, blackouts, or water rationing. That means you need a mix that includes low prep calories and foods that do not require fragile refrigeration. It also means your meal plan becomes simpler under stress, because stress taxes decision-making. When systems fail, complexity becomes a tax you cannot afford. Your pantry should reduce choices, not create them. The quiet threat is not only government control, it is social pressure and opportunistic theft. In a crisis, food becomes a magnet for attention, and attention becomes risk. You do not advertise. You do not posture. You do not turn provisioning into a personality. You keep packaging and storage disciplined, clean, and pest-proof, because spoilage is a self-inflicted siege. You also keep your household's consumption patterns steady, because dramatic shifts are how neighbors start counting your meals. This is not paranoia. This is how humans behave when their children are hungry. Food controls are predictable because hunger is predictable. You survive by building a household that can keep eating when the shelf goes silent. Medical supply is where crisis policy becomes personal, because the state does not treat medicine like groceries. It treats medicine like control. The moment demand spikes or logistics fracture, prescriptions become rationed by rule, not by compassion. Pharmacies run short on basics first, then start receiving allocation guidance. Hospitals shift to triage logic, which means the system will prioritize survivability and throughput, not your comfort. Meanwhile, the legal layer tightens, especially around controlled medications, syringes, certain antibiotics, and anything associated with misuse or black markets. In that environment, seizure often means denial of access, substitution without your preference, forced documentation, or confiscation when drugs are found without lawful proof. You do not argue your way out of that. You outplan it. Your protocol starts with accepting an ugly fact. If you need ongoing medication, your most valuable survival asset is not the pills. It is the legitimacy chain that keeps you eligible to receive them. You maintain current prescriptions, you keep your prescriber information, and you keep a clean list of every medication, dose, schedule, and diagnosis it supports. You protect that list like an identity document because in a disrupted system, it becomes your proof of continuity. You also keep your insurance details, pharmacy history, and any prior authorization documentation accessible. When systems are overloaded, anything that slows verification becomes a denial. Next, you build lawful buffer. In many jurisdictions and plans, certain medications can be filled in longer supplies, switched to generics, or delivered through mail order. Where early refills are permitted for travel, disaster preparation, or supply interruptions, you handle it openly with your clinician and pharmacist. You do not invent stories. You do not try to game controlled substance rules. That is how you get flagged. And in a crisis, flags turn into hard stops. The correct move is transparent planning, because transparency reduces suspicion and speeds approval. If a medication is frequently back-ordered, you ask your clinician about alternatives now while choices still exist. You also ask about taper plans if applicable, because abrupt discontinuation can become a medical emergency that traps you in the very system that is failing. Then, you address the non-prescription layer, because most people bleed out of crises through preventable complications. You keep a sober inventory of first aid consumables, fever and pain control, electrolyte support, wound care, and sanitation. You do not build a cosplay trauma kit you cannot use. You build a kit matched to your training and likely injuries. Burns, cuts, infections, dehydration, and chronic condition flare-ups. The goal is to reduce your need to enter crowded facilities where you will be deprioritized, exposed, or delayed. Finally, you establish continuity of care behavior. You keep a written emergency contact plan for clinicians and caregivers. You keep your key medical documents protected from water and fire. You keep your condition stable through routine compliance, because the most dangerous moment in a crisis is when a chronic issue becomes acute and forces you into the public pipeline. In a collapse, medicine is not just health. Medicine is access. Access is control. You survive by making your access provable, lawful, and redundant before the world starts rationing your breath. Weapons and ammunition are the category where a crisis stops being abstract and starts becoming a legal trap. In normal times, ownership rules feel stable because enforcement is routine and predictable. In a real emergency, the state's priority is not your individual sense of preparedness. Its priority is public order, and weapons are treated as accelerants. That is why emergency powers, curfews, temporary restrictions, and transport rules tend to tighten first in areas experiencing unrest, disaster response, or political instability. Sometimes it is formal, published, and clear. Sometimes it is informal, enforced through checkpoints and selective scrutiny. Either way, the effect is the same. The margin for misunderstanding collapses, and what would have been a minor administrative issue becomes a serious incident because the environment is already charged. The survival error is thinking this is about cleverness. It is not. In a crisis, clever behavior reads as hostile behavior. The only sustainable posture is compliance and control. You keep your legal status clean, your licensing and registrations current where applicable, and your documentation accessible and protected the same way you protect identity papers. You stop treating social media and casual conversation like harmless outlets, because the fastest path to losing what you own is to advertise it, joke about it, or posture with it. Crisis enforcement is fueled by tips, rumors, and optics. The people who get checked are the people who look like problems. Storage becomes even more important in an emergency because accidents, theft, and allegations spike. Secure storage is not just a safety practice, it is an evidentiary shield. If something goes wrong, you want your life to be explainable in one sentence. Responsibly stored, controlled access, no reckless handling, no public display. You also consider the reality of the home itself. A weapon does not secure a household if the household is porous. Locks, lighting, visibility control, and family procedures reduce risk more reliably than any tool you can hold. Crisis environments punish improvisation. They reward rehearsed, boring competence. Transport and movement are where people ruin themselves. Restrictions can change rapidly, and the same road that was normal yesterday can become a checkpoint today. You do not rely on assumptions about what is probably fine. You verify local rules through official channels when possible, and you avoid unnecessary movement in general, because every interaction with stressed enforcement is a dice roll you do not need. If you must move, you ensure you can do so lawfully and safely, with zero ambiguity about your intent. The goal is to pass through friction, not to win an encounter. Training matters, but not in the way fantasists mean it. Training is not aggression. Training is safe handling, decision discipline, and knowing the legal boundaries of force in your jurisdiction, which are often narrower than people believe, and become even more perilous under emergency scrutiny. The most survivable outcome is always the one that avoids violence. If you create a moment that forces you to justify your actions later, you have already entered the danger zone because courts, investigators, and public opinion do not become more forgiving during a crisis. They become less. If you own weapons, treat them as a responsibility that can either protect your continuity or destroy it. In a collapse, your objective is not dominance. Your objective is to remain free, lawful, and alive, while the system is nervous and looking for easy examples. Communications is where a crisis becomes a contest over reality. The state does not only control fuel and food, it controls coordination and narrative. When stability cracks, authorities and platforms throttle bandwidth, shut down networks, restrict certain services, and expand monitoring under emergency powers. At the street level, communications gear becomes suspicious because it signals organization. At the policy level, radio use becomes sensitive because it bypasses centralized channels. This is why seizure in this category often looks like device inspection, temporary confiscation at checkpoints, compelled account access in some jurisdictions, or charges tied to licensing and interference rules rather than any dramatic raid. You do not survive this by acting clever. You survive it by being disciplined, lawful, and redundant. Your first principle is legitimacy. If you operate radios, you treat licensing and operating rules as non-negotiable. In a calm year, sloppy compliance is a nuisance. In an emergency, it becomes a pretext. You keep any required licenses current, you keep equipment within legal bans and power limits, and you avoid behavior that resembles jamming, impersonation, or interference. The crisis environment is saturated with rumor and paranoia. You do not add radio guy causing problems to your risk profile. Your second principle is redundancy that does not depend on one fragile network. The mistake is assuming the smartphone is a permanent portal. It is not. It is a single device that can be lost, broken, confiscated temporarily, or rendered useless by dead batteries and dead towers. You plan for that by keeping critical contacts, addresses, and emergency procedures available in at least one offline form that does not require a login. You also accept that communication is not only about sending messages, it is about receiving trustworthy signals. You identify official sources, local alert systems, and community channels before the crisis, because once the signal is noisy, you will not have time to build trust. Your third principle is privacy hygiene, not for evasion, but for resilience. A crisis increases opportunistic crime and coercion. You reduce what your device exposes if it is viewed by others, stolen, or accessed under lawful process. Strong authentication, timely updates, and minimal sensitive data stored on the device are not ideological moves. They are damage control. You treat your phone like a wallet full of keys, and you stop carrying keys you cannot afford to lose. Finally, you adopt communication discipline. You keep messages short, factual, and operational. You do not broadcast inventories, routes, or schedules. You do not escalate with bravado. In collapse conditions, words can become evidence, targets, or invitations. Communication is a tool. Use it like a scalpel, not like a siren. Identity becomes a gate in the first phase of serious instability. When systems strain, the state narrows who gets access to movement, fuel, medicine, relief, and even employment. It does that through documentation because documents are the simplest way to turn chaos into categories. Curfews are enforced by checking who you are and why you are outside. Relief lines are filtered by proof of residence and household status. Checkpoints become routine. In some crises, employers, landlords, and service providers start demanding paperwork they never cared about before, because they are also trying to reduce their own risk. This is why identity documents and proof of status are among the first things functionally seized. Not always taken from you, but controlled in a way that makes access conditional. Without them, you are not just invisible, you are non-compliant by default. Your protocol is simple and ruthless. You make your identity portable, protected, and quickly provable under stress. That starts with knowing what counts. Government-issued photo ID, passports, residency documents, vehicle documentation, insurance, and any medical or caregiving paperwork that establishes priority or necessity. Then you harden it against the most common crisis killers: fire, water, and panic. Originals are stored in a protected, grab-ready manner, not buried in a drawer under forgotten clutter. If you cannot retrieve your documents in under 1 minute, you do not truly possess them. You also ensure the people in your household know where the document cache is and what to take if you are incapacitated, because crisis does not respect the assumption that you will be the one making decisions. Next, you create legitimate duplicates. This is not about forging or gaming. It is about continuity. Copies can help replace originals and prove identity when systems are slow. In many cases, notarized copies or certified extracts exist as legal alternatives for specific needs. Where that is appropriate, you arrange it in advance. You also protect digital access, but you do not depend on it. Scanned documents stored securely can be valuable, but only if you can access them without a dead battery, a dead network, or an account lockout. The best digital plan is one that assumes the internet is unreliable. Then you address the operational layer: travel and interaction. You keep a small friction kit that contains the minimum documents needed for routine movement and emergency verification, stored securely, not waved around. You do not volunteer extra information. You do not argue. In a crisis, the winning move is speed and clarity. You provide what is required, you stay calm, you leave. The objective is to avoid becoming a problem that needs additional attention. Identity is not just paperwork. In collapse conditions, it is your access token to the remaining fragments of the old world. Treat it like life support. Portable wealth is seductive because it feels like control. In a crisis, it can become the opposite: a magnet for scrutiny, theft, and temporary authority. Valuables are targeted for one reason that has nothing to do with morality and everything to do with physics. They are dense. They move fast. They convert into food, favors, and escape. That makes them politically sensitive and socially dangerous. When the environment turns hostile, you will see a spectrum of pressure. Sometimes it is informal: a police officer advising you to hand something over for safekeeping. Sometimes it is bureaucratic: requirements to declare assets at borders, during curfews, or when relief eligibility is being determined. Sometimes it is simply opportunistic crime wearing the mask of necessity. However it arrives, the outcome is the same. If your valuables exist only as rumors and memory, they are already gone. Your protocol begins with proof. You document what you own while the world is calm enough for records to mean something. Photographs, serial numbers, appraisals for high-value items, receipts, warranty documentation, and insurance schedules turn a private object into a recoverable asset. That is not vanity paperwork. It is the difference between loss and restitution when theft, fire, or forced displacement happens. You also establish clear ownership and succession. In crises, families fracture under stress, and contested property becomes poison. If something matters, its chain of custody must be simple and defensible. Then you make disciplined storage decisions based on threat models, not fear. Home storage reduces third-party dependence but increases exposure to burglary, coercion, and disaster. Institutional storage can reduce opportunistic theft risk but introduces access constraints when banks close, areas are cordoned, or services are suspended. There is no perfect option, only trade-offs. The survivable move is diversification across locations and formats, combined with the ability to access enough value quickly for continuity without turning yourself into a walking target. Finally, you manage signature. You do not advertise. You do not display. You do not treat valuables as identity. In a collapse, optics can trigger attention from criminals, neighbors, or nervous officials. The goal is to remain boring, documented, insured, and operationally liquid without becoming a story anyone feels entitled to edit. Now, you assemble the operating protocol because separate preparations that do not interlock become dead weight. The mistake most people make is treating each category as a different hobby. Money is finance. Fuel is prep. Food is stocking up. Medicine is health. Documents are adulting. Valuables are insurance. In a crisis, those labels evaporate. What remains is one problem: continuity under constraint. The system will not fail evenly. It will fail in patches, in policies, in outages, and in enforcement moods. You survive by building 3 layers that can carry you when any single layer collapses. The first layer is on-hand capability, the small slice of resources you can access immediately without permission, without power, and without negotiation. This is not about hoarding. This is about bridging the first shock, when shelves empty, networks fail, and people behave badly. If you cannot function for a short window with what is already inside your home, you are not a household, you are a customer. And customers die first when the store goes silent. The second layer is cached-in-place resilience, the deeper inventory that stays stable, safe, and legally compliant, designed to support routine living when the outside world becomes expensive, rationed, or hostile. This layer is where discipline matters: rotation, maintenance, and a clear understanding of what you actually consume. If your supplies cannot be integrated into normal life, they will rot, break, or become impossible to manage when stress erodes your attention. The third layer is off-site but accessible redundancy, because concentration is fragility. Fire, flood, forced displacement, or a single burglary can erase everything you thought you owned. This layer is not about secrecy. It is about dispersal, documentation, and recovery. If you cannot prove what you own, you do not truly own it. If you cannot access any portion of it under disruption, it is not a reserve. It is a rumor. Then you adopt low-signature living as a survival stance. You stay boring. You keep your mouth closed. You avoid turning preparedness into performance because performance attracts eyes, and eyes become requests, demands, and investigations. You do not challenge the system head-on. You design your life so the system's controls hurt you less. This is the final warning. Collapse punishes the dramatic and rewards the methodical. The old world is over the moment access becomes conditional. Your plan is not to win arguments. Your plan is to keep breathing when the rules change without asking you.